Story number 1. Hell's Parcels. I've lived all my life in the tiny village of Willowford, nestled in a valley where two winding roads converge by a narrow creek. Most people who pass through hardly know they've entered one town before they've already left it. We're that small. We have a single grocery store, a gas station that doubles as a mechanic shop, and the post office, which is our hub of daily life. Everyone knows everyone, the sort of place where secrets rarely stay hidden for long. At least, that's what we believed. I never expected that the old post office, where I've worked as a mail carrier for the past few years, could hide something more dangerous and malevolent than any ghost story we told as kids. If I'd known what was waiting for me behind those cramped walls of aged wood and dusty shelves, I would have quit the day I started. But it's too late for that now, and if you're reading this, I'm begging you, if ever you receive a package with no return address, think twice before you open it. What follows is my attempt to piece together the events that turned Willowford into a shadow of its former self, and me into a sleepless wreck. I'm writing this from a place far away, where I pray the things that lurk in the post office can't find me. But I'm not entirely sure there's anywhere left to hide. Before everything went wrong, my days were as ordinary as any small-town mail carrier's could be. I'd wake before dawn, have a quick breakfast of toast and coffee, then walk 5 minutes to the post office, an old, squat building with a single front counter, 2 rickety benches, and a few rows of P.O. boxes. Our postmaster, Mr. Howard, was pushing 70 and had worked there for as long as anyone could remember. He took pride in knowing each resident by name and often insisted on placing a piece of candy in outgoing parcels as a friendly thank you to the recipients. I liked my job. I enjoyed the routine, sorting letters and packages for each route, loading up the old USPS truck. It always rattled ominously, as if held together by luck rather than bolts, and then making my rounds through Willowford's quiet streets. Many houses dated back to the early 1900s, some even older, and each one had its own character. I'd learned which front gates squeaked, which doorbells didn't work, and which dogs barked the loudest. There wasn't much to disrupt the monotony of those days. Maybe a letter from overseas for an aunt with pen pals, or a package from a fancy department store that made someone's eyes light up. The people of Willowford were simple, content with small pleasures. We seldom had big drama, beyond the typical gossip that circulated in any close-knit community. Then one Monday, maybe 6 months ago, everything changed. It was early. I'd already unlocked the mail truck and was double-checking the day's load. Mr. Howard was inside the building, humming some old tune while sorting letters. A faint morning fog clung to the road, softening the harsh edges of reality. That was when I noticed a large, olive-green package lying by the back door, unmarked and sealed with a thick layer of packing tape. I frowned. We didn't usually get deliveries that way. Parcels came in on the freight truck at 5 in the morning, and I'd already accounted for everything on the manifest. This one was different, no postage, no address, no barcodes. I considered ignoring it, figuring it was just a leftover box from a previous shipment. But something about it felt off. It was too heavy, for starters, and the cardboard looked aged, discolored at the edges, as if it had been stored in a damp cellar for decades. Curiosity got the better of me. I bent down and tried to pick it up. My back nearly gave out from the weight. This thing must have weighed a good 50 pounds, maybe more. Surprised, I set it back down, letting out a small grunt. "Hey, Howard," I called, sticking my head through the door. "Did you know there's a giant package out here?" His footsteps approached. When he saw it, he adjusted his glasses. "No label? That's odd. Maybe someone dropped it off by mistake." We pondered for a moment, then Howard shrugged. "Set it aside in the storage room. We'll open it later, see if there's any clue who it belongs to." That was the plan. Neither of us had any idea how big a mistake it would be to open that box. I went about my route for the rest of the day. The morning fog lifted to reveal a mild, sunny day. Birds sang lazily in the trees, and dogs trotted along behind fences, barking greetings. Nothing seemed out of place. During lunch, I found myself thinking about that package. Something about its presence nagged at me, like a mosquito whining around my ear. I dismissed the feeling. After all, we got weird deliveries once in a while. But that odd sense of foreboding wouldn't let go. When I returned to the post office that afternoon, Mr. Howard gave me a tight smile. He was standing by the storage room door, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. I tried to move that package inside, but it's heavier than I thought, he said, looking spooked. Mind giving me a hand? We hauled it into the storage room at the back of the post office, where old filing cabinets and boxes of supplies gathered dust. Even with the two of us, the package was unwieldy, and I couldn't help noticing how cold it felt to the touch, as though it had been sitting in a freezer. The cardboard left a faint damp imprint on my palms. Let's see what we're dealing with, Howard murmured. He grabbed a box cutter from a shelf, carefully slicing through the thick tape. A musty odor escaped, like mildew and something else I couldn't identify. Something metallic, maybe iron. My nose wrinkled in discomfort. Inside was a battered wooden crate, with nails hammered in at odd angles. We pried them out with a crowbar, hearts thumping faster than the situation should have warranted. People open packages all the time, right? The lid came free with a creak, and we stared. Nestled among crumpled newspapers was an old, ornate ring. It looked like tarnished silver, with a blood-red stone in the center. The stone glinted in the dim light, almost as though it were alive. Next to the ring lay a single sheet of paper, folded in half, stained yellow around the edges. Howard picked it up. No writing on the outside. He unfolded it carefully. I leaned in, trying to see. It contained a single sentence, scrawled in a spidery hand. To claim what is owed, place this upon your finger. Howard and I exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly the ring seemed menacing. The stone caught the overhead light, flaring briefly. I felt an irrational urge to slam the crate shut. Howard let out a shaky breath. We should lock this up. See if anyone reports a missing ring, maybe put a note on the board. I nodded. Yeah. Good idea. We sealed the crate again. Neither of us wanted to look at that ring any longer. What kind of bizarre joke was this? And who would send it to us? I had no answers, but a knot of anxiety settled in my gut. As we secured the package, I couldn't shake the sense that we just welcomed something malignant into Willowford. A few days passed without incident. The ring, locked in the storage room, weighed on my mind, though I never talked about it. Every time I walked by the door, I felt a whisper of cold, as though the air was a couple of degrees lower there. But life went on, sorting mail, delivering letters, making small talk with the locals who popped by to check their P.O. boxes or buy stamps. One morning, an elderly woman named Mrs. Cartwright shuffled in, clutching a notice slip. She was around 80, with shaky hands and a sweet smile that revealed missing teeth. I got this in my mailbox, she said, handing me a slip that read, package at post office, signature required. I checked the ledger. Sure enough, it said a package had arrived for her. My heart jumped when I realized it had no return address listed. I swallowed and retrieved it from the back shelf. A smallish box, maybe the size of a toaster, sealed in plain brown paper with thick tape. My discomfort grew when I realized it felt strangely cold and heavier than it should. I forced a smile, scanning Mrs. Cartwright's ID before handing it over. Here you go, ma'am. She gave a polite nod. Thank you, dear. Hope it's something nice from my grandson. I waited, half expecting the box to hum or scream or something equally horrific. But Mrs. Cartwright ambled out, none the wiser. That afternoon, word spread that a few other villagers had also received mysterious parcels. Each was wrapped with that same thick tape, no return address, no postmark. Our records simply showed them as dropped off. Dropped off by whom? We had no cameras, and we rarely locked the post office door during open hours. Anyone could have walked in and left a package on the counter, waiting for a busy moment when we didn't notice. But these weren't just random deliveries. I could feel it in my bones. And I wasn't the only one. Mr. Howard paced the small office, muttering about how unusual this was. I've never seen so many unmarked packages, he confided, sweat beading on his brow. Feels like someone's playing a game with us. He had no idea how dark that game would become. It began with a phone call, early one morning. I just stepped through the post office door when the landline on the counter rang. Mr. Howard hurried to answer. The voice on the other end was frantic, nearly hysterical. I heard him muttering reassurances, voice trembling. He hung up, looking pale. That was the sheriff. Mrs. Cartwright, she passed away last night. A chill rushed through me. I remembered her tottering out of the post office with that box just days ago. How? She was old, but she seemed in decent health. Howard swallowed. Sheriff said it looked like a heart attack, but there was some odd detail. A ring on her finger that none of her family recognized. She was clutching it so tightly her knuckles turned white. We stared at each other in horror, thinking the same thing, the ring we'd found. But that ring was still locked in our storage, wasn't it? After a moment, Howard rushed to the back room, his footsteps heavy on the worn linoleum. I followed, heart pounding. We tore open the cabinet. The crate was still there, unopened. The ring inside, unchanged, as far as we could see. But the mention of a mysterious ring on Mrs. Cartwright's finger was too much of a coincidence. Or maybe the parcel she received contained a ring as well. I felt my stomach knot. Later that day, an eerie hush descended on Williford. Word spread that Mrs. Cartwright had been found in her bedroom, eyes open, face frozen in a look of terror. Whispers circulated about unnatural markings on her chest, though the sheriff refused to confirm any details. People started to wonder if the unknown parcels could be connected. Those who had received them began to worry. I overheard one man, Mr. Duffy, muttering to his wife that he planned to burn the item he got, a tarnished pocket watch that just looked wrong. Another resident, Miss Caldwell, told me she'd received an old photograph so faded she could only make out a smudge, but it had given her nightmares nonetheless. The local paper's gossip column hinted at dark omens and the devil's mail, but no one took it too seriously. At least, not yet. The next week, more parcels arrived. We tried to keep track, but it was impossible. They appeared on our shelves, at the back door, and corners of the building where no one ever went. Each bore a name from Williford, and each recipient told a similar story. The object inside was old, rusty, or tarnished, and exuded a strange heaviness, as if it carried a burden. I remember the day I delivered a package to Mr. Larson, the local butcher. He opened it right there, in front of me. The inside held a corroded knife blade, wrapped in oil-stained cloth. Its handle was missing, leaving only the jagged tang. Larson let out a quiet grunt, clearly disturbed. He slammed the box shut and muttered something about calling the sheriff, but I doubted he'd do it. Fear and confusion kept people silent, hoping the strangeness would pass. And all the while, the post office changed. At first, it was subtle. The walls seemed to close in, or the lighting felt dimmer even when the bulbs were new. Certain spots, especially around the storage room, grew noticeably colder. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced someone was watching. Yet it was just an empty hallway, or was it? Mr. Howard seemed to sense it too. Late one evening, as we were locking up, he said, "Have you noticed how it's always drafty now? Even when we shut all the windows?" I nodded, wiping sweat from my temple. Ironically, the rest of the building felt stuffy, but that corridor leading to the storage room felt like an icebox. He pursed his lips. "Feels like the building's breathing. Like it's alive." He said it half-jokingly, but I could see fear in his eyes. I felt it too. The hush that filled the post office reminded me of a sleeping animal, except I sensed it was only pretending to sleep, waiting for the right moment to strike. The death toll rose. Mrs. Cartwright was only the first. Within a week, Mr. Duffy, who threatened to burn his cursed pocket watch, fell down the stairs in his own home, snapping his neck. The sheriff called it an accident, but neighbors swore they heard him screaming before he fell, as if he'd seen something. Miss Caldwell had a seizure in the middle of the night. The paramedics arrived too late. Her fists were clenched around that blurred photograph, crumpling it so hard she tore it in half. A neighbor who found her claimed the walls of her bedroom were covered in scratches, as though she'd raked them with her fingernails in a fit of terror. Rumors spread like wildfire. Folks began blaming these tragedies on the parcels. Some, desperate to rid themselves of the objects, tried to throw them away or bury them. But inevitably, the items would return, found on doorsteps, and mailboxes, or clutched inexplicably in the owner's hands upon waking. One man left town entirely, packing everything he owned into his truck. He was found 3 days later on a desolate stretch of highway, unconscious, with the cursed item still in his front seat. My own nightmares escalated. I dreamed of the post office corridors stretching on forever, piled high with rotting packages that bled thick, black fluid. The ring we'd found haunted me in my sleep, its red stone glowing like an evil eye. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of rasping breaths echoing in my ears. I decided to investigate. I needed answers. Who was sending these parcels? Why were they targeting Williford? Was it all a hoax that turned deadly by coincidence, or something more supernatural? As crazy as it sounded, I suspected the latter. Something in the air carried the tang of the forbidden. The nightmares, the unexplainable chills, the rising body count, it all pointed to forces beyond rational explanation. I started by reviewing the post office logs, scanning for any mention of these deliveries. As I feared, the records were incomplete. There were no receipts, no tracking numbers, just a series of blank spaces where parcels seemed to appear out of nowhere. Mr. Howard's face darkened as he flipped through the pages, each one bearing silent testimony to an impossible phenomenon. "It's like they come from the building itself," he murmured one evening. That notion unsettled me more than anything else. Could the post office be some sort of gateway? An entity? I recalled the odd drafts, the sense of a presence lurking in the walls. Desperate, I traveled to the county archives, rummaging through old records about Williford's history. Nothing out of the ordinary. The town was founded in the late 1800s by a small group of settlers. The land was once farmland, then slowly turned into a hamlet with a modest logging industry. The post office was built around 1905, expanded in the 1950s, and renovated again in the 1970s. No mention of curses or dark rituals. But an old black and white photo caught my eye. It showed a group of men in front of the post office sometime in the 1920s. One man stood slightly apart from the rest, wearing a grim expression. Underneath the photo, the caption read, "Postmaster Finley and Staff, 1923. The building behind them looked almost the same, except for a battered sign reading Williford Post with a single broken letter. Something about that sign made my skin crawl. The letter O in Post was missing, giving it the eerie look of PST. I took a photocopy of that image, though I couldn't say why. Something in Postmaster Finley's eyes disturbed me. They seemed resigned, almost hollow, like a man who'd witnessed terrible things. One night, fueled by a combination of terror and determination, I convinced Mr. Howard to keep watch with me inside the post office after hours. We locked the doors, turned off the lights, and sat in silence at the counter. The plan was simple. If the packages were truly appearing out of nowhere, maybe we'd catch a glimpse of how it happened. 4 hours, nothing. The building remained quiet, the air stagnant. Around midnight, we both fought drowsiness. My head bobbed, eyes flickering shut. Then a clattering noise jolted us awake. We grabbed flashlights, creeping toward the sound. It seemed to come from the storage room. A cold draft swirled around our ankles, and the hallway lights flickered. My heart hammered as we reached the door. Howard flipped the switch, illuminating the cramped space. At first, everything looked normal: stacks of supplies, a few crates, the locked cabinet where we kept the cursed ring. Then we saw a fresh package lying in the center of the floor. It was large, damp with condensation, as though someone had pulled it up from a well. The cardboard glistened, water beading on the surface. We looked at each other, trembling. "You locked the door, right?" I whispered. Howard nodded. "Deadbolt and chain." Yet here was a new package, no sign of forced entry. The overhead light flickered again, dimming to near darkness. A deep, resonant thump echoed through the walls, like a heartbeat. Howard clutched my arm. "Do you feel that?" he hissed. I nodded, teeth chattering. The building vibrated, a low hum that reverberated through my bones. It felt like the post office was alive, exhaling slow, rotten breaths. Suddenly, the new package twitched. I swear I saw it move an inch or two across the linoleum. My stomach twisted. This was too much. Howard flicked his flashlight off and on in panic, as though trying to chase away the shadows. Then, the package tore open from the inside. We both yelled, staggering backward. Something slender and black slithered out. At first, I thought it was a snake. But as it uncoiled, I realized it was a length of rusted chain, dripping with slimy, dark fluid. It thumped onto the floor, twisting like an eel out of water. I choked back bile at the sight. "Nope, nope, nope," Howard muttered. He grabbed my sleeve, hauling me away. "We're leaving." I didn't argue. We sprinted for the exit. Behind us, the chain rattled, scraping the floor as it snaked across the tiles. An unearthly moan filled the air, rattling the windows. We fumbled with the locks, nearly wrenching the door off its hinges in our scramble to escape. Outside, the cool night air felt suffocating, tinted with the stench of decay. We drove away from the post office at breakneck speed, neither of us daring to look back. I've never felt panic like that before or since. That night confirmed what we dreaded. The post office was no longer just a building. It was a conduit for something evil, spitting out cursed objects to claim the souls of Williford's residents. The next day, Mr. Howard called me at dawn, his voice shaking. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Meet me at the old diner." I arrived to find him hunched in a booth, wringing his hands. His normally calm, fatherly demeanor was gone. He looked decades older, eyes bloodshot. A cup of untouched coffee sat before him. "Remember that photograph you found at the archives?" he began, not meeting my gaze. "Postmaster Finley, 1923? I nodded. "My grandfather worked under him," Howard continued, voice hushed. "He never spoke much about it, but one day, when I was a teenager, he told me that Finley was obsessed with contacting something. He kept journals, performed strange rituals after midnight in the post office basement. My grandfather stumbled upon one such ceremony and saw Finley chanting in front of a makeshift altar made of male sacks. He said it looked like Finley was making offerings of parcels, each containing a personal item from someone in town." Howard took a shaky breath. "People started dying. Accidents, illnesses. Rumors spread that Finley had made a pact with a dark power, trading the souls of villagers in exchange for something. Eventually, Finley disappeared without a trace." I stared at him, skin prickling. "So you think this presence has been lying dormant in the post office, and now it's awake again?" Mr. Howard nodded. "I don't know how or why, but I can't deny what we've seen. Something's continuing Finley's work, sending out these cursed parcels to claim more lives." My stomach turned. Suddenly, the ring we'd found, the chain, the photograph, it all fit a nightmarish puzzle. Each item was more than just an antique, it was an invitation for a malevolent force to latch onto someone's deepest fears and regrets. "We have to stop it," I said. "Destroy the place, burn it down if we have to." Mr. Howard gave a hollow laugh. "That may be the only way. But we need to be careful. This thing, it has its claws in the whole building. We could end up unleashing it even more." We sat in silence, the gravity of our situation crushing. Outside, the day had barely begun, but I felt an icy despair settling over me. We decided on a plan that, in retrospect, was sheer madness. We would gather every cursed parcel we could find, bring them back to the post office, and attempt to break the cycle by destroying them all at once. Maybe, just maybe, that would sever the link this entity had with Williford. Convincing the townspeople proved difficult. Some refused to part with the items, either out of fear or because the objects had exerted an inexplicable hold on them. Others were more than willing, dropping them at our feet with trembling relief. We took them all: rusty knives, cracked mirrors, old photos, tattered books, tarnished jewelry. They piled up in the back of Howard's pickup, an ugly testament to the scale of this horror. Meanwhile, the body count ticked upward. Mr. Larson, the butcher, was found slumped behind his counter, the corroded knife blade piercing his heart. A newlywed couple from out of town, who'd just settled in Williford, died in a freak house fire, their cursed package melted into the ashes. Each death drove us further down the path of desperation. Finally, one gloomy afternoon, we had a truck bed loaded with cursed artifacts. Mr. Howard and I parked behind the post office. With dread, we unlocked the back door, stepping into the stale gloom. The air felt charged, electric. It was as though the walls themselves vibrated with anticipation, eager for the next sacrifice. We lugged the boxes of cursed items inside, stacking them in the center of the floor. The building groaned, as if in protest. My ears popped from the pressure, and Mr. Howard wiped sweat from his brow. "Now," he whispered, pulling out a can of kerosene. "We burn it." We soaked the pile in kerosene, the fumes choking. All the while, we felt that presence swirling around us, a cold malevolence pressing in. I flicked a lighter, hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Flames burst forth, dancing along the drenched objects. Thick, black smoke billowed. For a moment, hope surged in me. We were doing it, we were destroying the cursed items that had claimed so many lives. Then the post office roared. I can't describe it any other way. The entire building let out a sound like a wounded beast, timbers groaning in agony. A violent gust of wind exploded from nowhere, snuffing out the flames as though they'd been a child's candle. The smoke vanished, leaving a cold, suffocating silence. Mr. Howard and I staggered back, coughing. I realized with horror that the cursed items remained untouched. The kerosene still glistened on them, but the fire had simply died. An overwhelming wave of despair crashed over me. We had pinned our last hopes on these flames, yet the entity inside the post office was too strong. The lights flickered, then darkness. A scraping noise erupted from the walls, like nails raking wood. The front door slammed shut on its own, followed by the rattling of the chain lock. We were trapped. A red glow filled the corridor, radiating from the storage room. My mind flashed to the ring's crimson stone. I pictured it glowing in the dark, malevolent and hungry. Mr. Howard grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit at the back. But the doorknob wouldn't budge, as though the metal had fused. We were sealed in with this horror. The building shook again. Parcels tumbled off shelves, spilling across the floor. My ears rang with a cacophony of rattles, moans, and the echo of countless screams. It was as if every damned soul claimed by these objects was crying out from the walls. I felt my sanity teeter on the edge. Then came a voice, soft at first, then louder, whispering my name. I froze, hard hammering. It was my mother's voice, though she died years ago. She called to me, pleading. My vision blurred with tears. For a moment, I almost believed it was her. I took a step forward, ignoring Mr. Howard's frantic warnings. A shape coalesced in the corridor, vaguely human, though twisted. In the flickering red glow, I saw a feminine silhouette, face contorted in sorrow. I recognized features that resembled my mother, but only if I squinted. It beckoned with one hand, the other holding that old ring. I felt a compulsion to walk into its arms, to let that presence envelop me. All the grief I'd ever felt for losing my mother flared up, raw and overwhelming. Just as I faltered, Mr. Howard tackled me to the ground, snapping me out of the trance. The silhouette vanished with a hiss. We scrambled up, drenched in sweat, hearts pounding. "This building is feeding on our fears," Howard gasped. "Don't listen to it. Keep moving." We fought our way down the hallway, shoving aside toppling shelves. The ring's red glow pulsated like a beacon at the far end. Beneath my terror, I realized that if we could get the ring, maybe we could end this. The ring was the first cursed object we'd ever seen, possibly the key to the entire nightmare. We forced our way into the storage room. Sure enough, the ring lay there on the floor, glowing with an almost hypnotic radiance. I sensed an intelligence behind that glow, ancient and enraged. The chain we'd seen before slithered around it protectively, like a monstrous serpent. Mr. Howard cursed under his breath, fumbling for something in his pocket, a small hammer. Without hesitation, he brought the hammer down on the ring. Sparks flew, a piercing shriek filling the air. The chain lashed out, striking him across the chest. He cried out in pain, but slammed the hammer again. This time, the ring cracked, a hairline fracture splitting the stone. A wild wind whipped through the room, scattering papers and dust, howling like 1,000 tortured souls. The walls shook violently. It felt like the building might collapse. I grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor, smashing the chain as it writhed. The metal links snapped under the impact, dissolving into black sludge. Mr. Howard struck the ring a final time. With a deafening crack, the red stone shattered into fragments, scattering across the floor. A wave of cold air blasted outward, nearly knocking us off our feet. Then, just as suddenly, the madness subsided. Silence fell over the post office. For a moment, neither of us dared to breathe. The building's lights flickered back on. The air felt lighter, as though a suffocating presence had lifted. Mr. Howard's face was streaked with blood from a gash on his forehead, but he managed a shaky grin. We staggered outside, finding the back door miraculously unlocked. Dawn was breaking. The sky glowed a soft pink, and a breeze carried the fresh scent of dew. I half expected the building to crumble behind us, but it remained standing. The post office looked unchanged, its weathered facade bathed in early morning light. Yet we both knew something fundamental had shifted. The ring was destroyed, and with it, the core of the entity that had haunted Willowford. The pile of cursed items in the middle of the floor now looked dull and lifeless. I could almost hear the building release a final, rattling breath. It's been weeks since that awful night. The strange death stopped. Willowford is slowly recovering, though a somber weight lingers over the village. Too many friends and neighbors were lost for us to ever fully return to normal. But at least the parcel ceased. No more unmarked boxes, no more cursed relics. The post office still stands, though it feels hollow now, as if a terrible occupant has been evicted. Mr. Howard retired a few days after our confrontation. He handed in his keys with shaking hands, saying he couldn't bear to stay in that place any longer. I can't blame him. I left too, though I didn't bother with a formal resignation. The nightmares might never fully leave me, but I had to get away. Some folks wanted to burn the post office to the ground, fearful of any lingering evil. Others argued it was a historic building, part of Willowford's identity. In the end, the mayor decided to keep it, but rarely does anyone go inside. A younger postmaster has taken over, though rumor says he rarely shows up in person, forwarding all mail to a larger facility a few towns away. Residents pick up their letters elsewhere now, preferring to avoid the building that nearly consumed their souls. Me, I moved far away. I took these notes with me, writing them down as best I could, hoping to make sense of it all. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, imagining I hear a mail truck in the distance or footsteps outside my door. In those moments, I can almost swear I see a faint red glow under the crack. But I tell myself it's just my imagination. A part of me wonders, was it truly over when we shattered that ring? We destroyed the direct manifestation, but if the post office remains, does that old malevolence still lurk, waiting for a new caretaker or an unsuspecting soul to feed on? I can't say for certain. All I know is that if you ever find yourself in Willowford, take heed. If you pass by the old post office with its peeling paint and crooked sign, you might feel a chill at your back. And if, God forbid, you ever receive a package with no return address, sealed tight with thick tape, weigh it carefully in your hands. Ask yourself, do you really want to open it? Because inside might be more than just an antique trinket. It might be a piece of hell itself, wrapped and delivered straight to your door. And trust me, hell always collects postage due. Story number 2. The Mine's Curse. I was just a boy the first time I heard the stories about Blackridge Mine. My grandfather would sit on his front porch in the cool Colorado twilight, a mug of steaming coffee by his side, and spin tales of the men who died in that dark labyrinth beneath the mountains. He told me about the echoes that carried up through the mine's abandoned shafts, how on certain nights, if the wind was just right, you could hear the faint tapping of pickaxes from men long dead. He described the thick dust that blanketed every crevice of the old town like a burial shroud, and the way the sun seemed reluctant to shine too brightly there, as though the very light feared what lay beneath the earth. As a kid, I soaked up these stories with rapt attention. Part of me believed they were just a product of my grandfather's imagination, cautionary tales to keep me from wandering near the boarded-up entrances. But another part of me, a deeper, instinctive part, sensed he was describing something real. Something we all tried to push out of our minds, but that existed nonetheless in the hush of the mountain winds. Years passed. I grew up, left Colorado for a while, went to college, got a job in Denver. My grandfather passed on, and with him went so many local legends. Eventually, I drifted back to my hometown of Black Ridge Creek, lured by nostalgia or maybe by a need to feel my roots in the dusty soil again. The place hadn't changed much, not on the surface. The single bar still sat on the corner of Main and Aspen Street, the diner still served undercooked hash browns, and the old mining museum remained locked more often than not. Most of the population lived in the same clapboard houses that had been around for generations. But things were stirring beneath the surface. Whispers circulated that a new mining company, Summit Star Industries, had decided to reopen the old tunnels of Black Ridge Mine. They claimed that modern technology would make excavation safe and profitable, that the horrors of the past were mere footnotes in the region's rich history. They offered jobs, promised economic renewal, and spoke confidently at town meetings. I sat in the back of those meetings and watched the townsfolk wrestle with their doubts. Many needed work. The old industries had dried up, and the younger generation either left or faced meager prospects flipping burgers or stocking shelves. Summit Star's promises sounded too good to pass up. A month after the official green light, bulldozers and trucks rolled in, trailing clouds of red-brown dust as they rumbled toward the gated entrances. Construction crews erected fences and posted signs, private property. No trespassing. Locals grumbled, but most were willing to see how the experiment played out. The mayor held a small ceremony by the new gates, cutting a ribbon while flashes from local reporters' cameras lit up the site. A few voices of protest went unheard, old-timers, eyes distant, muttering that the land should remain sealed, that the dead had earned their rest. I dismissed the talk of curses and ghosts, at first. I took a job as a freelance writer for the local paper, the Black Ridge Gazette, figuring I'd document the revival of the town. Part of me wanted to prove that progress could coexist with local folklore. I interviewed Summit Star representatives, wrote puff pieces about their advanced safety protocols, snapped photos of the new machinery. Everyone seemed confident this would be a fresh start. Things changed quickly once they broke into the deeper tunnels. They called it Shaft 9, an offshoot of the original mine that had collapsed a century ago, trapping hundreds of men in a matter of minutes. Only a handful made it out, their accounts grim and disjointed. Some reported hearing savage pounding from the collapsed rock, others claimed they saw flickers of pale shapes drifting through the dust and gloom. Whatever happened below ground that day, it seeded an enduring terror in the survivors that stayed with them until their deaths. When the modern crews first entered Shaft 9, they found rotted support beams, corridors choked with rubble, and stalagmites of rusted iron from old tools left behind. And something else. They wouldn't tell me everything, but from what I gathered, they discovered a deeper passage that didn't appear on any original map. Summit Star's geologists were baffled. The bedrock shouldn't have allowed for such an extensive set of tunnels. Yet their ground-penetrating radar indicated vast hollows far deeper than anticipated. Miners started reporting a steady, rhythmic tapping late in the day. It usually happened when the machines were off, during downtime or shift changes. A hollow, resonant clack echoing through the dark. At first, they figured it was loose rock settling. But the pattern grew insistent, like the methodical swing of a pickaxe. Some even claimed it matched a human heartbeat. Word spread among the workers, fueling paranoia. Summit Star tried to dismiss the rumors, attributing them to structural shifts. They posted warnings about potential cave-ins, told folks to keep calm, and threatened to fire anyone who talked to the press about superstitious nonsense. By the time I heard about it, the morale in the camp was already fraying. One day, a heavy equipment operator named Carlos approached me outside the diner, refusing to give his last name or let me take a photo. He simply said, "I can't do it anymore, man. Every time I go down there, I feel like something's watching me. The walls, they breathe." I raised an eyebrow. Breathe? Like air currents? He shook his head. No, like lungs. You know how your chest expands and contracts? That's what it feels like down there. Like the rock's alive, inhaling and exhaling. And that tapping, it's not random. It's like Morse code or something. I can almost feel it in my bones. Within a day, Carlos was gone, leaving behind a note pinned to the wall of his rented trailer. "I won't be claimed like them." No one ever saw him again. The next incident wasn't so easy for Summit Star to sweep under the rug. 2 miners went missing. Their names were Greg Holt and Sam Rodriguez. Both were seasoned workers with no history of mental health problems. Their colleagues last saw them heading into Shaft 9 to collect seismic data. When they didn't come out at the end of the shift, a search party went in. They found Greg's hard hat near a collapsed side tunnel, the lamp still flickering, casting dancing shadows on the damp walls. There was no sign of Sam. The footprints led deeper into an uncharted passage where the ceiling looked ready to cave at any second. The search party didn't go far. The air grew rancid, thick with a sulfurous stench. Some described it as the smell of rotting eggs, others said it was like old meat left to fester in an attic. Their eyes stung, and their lungs burned with every breath. One man said he heard faint moaning drifting from beyond a wall of collapsed stone, but the rest of the group insisted they only heard the tapping, slow and methodical. Summit Star halted operations for 2 days, citing a need to reinforce the structural integrity. Locals whispered that Greg and Sam were either dead or trapped somewhere no human should ever tread. I asked to interview the search party, but Summit Star's PR guy, a slick fellow named Rhodes, blocked me at every turn. He offered me a small bribe to keep my mouth shut about the missing men, which I declined. I was determined to find out the truth. The first time I saw them, I was alone in the deserted streets near the mine. It was dusk, that in-between time when the sky blazes orange and pink before surrendering to night. I stood outside the chain-link fence, snapping photos of the site. The huge excavators sat silent, their metal arms folded like giant insects at rest. A hush lay over the camp. No diesel generators, no voices, just the sigh of the wind passing through the valley. Then I noticed movement between the stacked crates near the tunnel entrance, 2 figures in dusty overalls, hunched over, limbs unnaturally rigid. At first, I thought they were tired miners. But something about them was wrong. Their motions were too stiff, their heads craned at odd angles. Even from a distance, I sensed an eerie quiet around them. They lifted their arms in unison, as though trying to wave me away, and I caught a glimpse of their faces in the dying light. Pale. Sunken eyes. Dirt caked around their mouths, the skin around their cheeks blotched with purple. It was as if they crawled out of a grave. I froze, my heart hammering. Part of me wanted to call out, but some primal instinct insisted I keep silent. The tapping sound, faint but distinct, rose from the ground beneath my feet. Thud, 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 each beat perfectly spaced. The figures drifted closer, their silhouettes flickering in the corner of my eye. And then, as quickly as they appeared, they were gone, dissolving into the gloom. Shaken, I rushed back to town. That night, I tossed and turned, haunted by the memory of those faces. They reminded me of pictures I'd seen in history books of plague victims, or of the bodies recovered from ancient catacombs. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, that I was overworked. But deep down, I knew it was real. They'd been real. Over the next few days, a suffocating tension enveloped Blackridge Creek. People started locking their doors and windows earlier in the evening, though crime wasn't the reason. They feared something else creeping along our streets, something unstoppable once the sun dipped below the horizon. Reports trickled in of ghostly miners appearing in backyards, on porches, sometimes just outside bedroom windows. They didn't knock or speak, they only stared. One woman claimed that when she flicked on her porch light, she found 2 of them huddled by the steps, gnawing at chunks of raw ore as though it were food. Another resident swore they heard chanting in the distance, followed by the rumble of shifting earth. The local sheriff, an aging man named Braxton, tried to keep order. "We're investigating," he repeated to anyone who confronted him. But his eyes betrayed deep anxiety. He had only a handful of deputies in a town used to the occasional bar fight or petty theft, not a supernatural siege. Rumors spread that the missing men from Summit Star's crew had joined the undead ranks, scouring the hillsides at night, drawn by the monstrous appetite of an ancient force beneath the mountain. My friend Lucy, a geologist who sometimes consulted for environmental assessments, came to see me with news that confirmed my worst fears. She'd been analyzing rock samples from the reopened mine, taken from the newly discovered labyrinth beyond Shaft 9. One core sample showed fossilized remains that didn't match any known species. Fragmented pieces of bone-like structures twisted into bizarre shapes. Worse, Lucy claimed to have found faint engravings on the rocks, crude symbols that resembled monstrous faces or devouring mouths. This is older than anything we've ever documented in Colorado, she whispered, pushing a photograph across my kitchen table. We're talking pre-human, possibly from an era no one studied in this region. The lines suggest. I don't know. Worship? Rituals? It's as if something down there was revered by ancient peoples, or perhaps something older than people entirely. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. An ancient entity? She nodded. Or at least, some type of presence. And I think the mining operation woke it up. The nightmares started soon after. At first, I thought they were just echoes of the day's horrors. But these dreams had a vividness that left me gasping for air upon waking. I'd see myself descending into a labyrinth of stone corridors, each lined with rusted rails and shattered lanterns. The walls pulsed as though alive, throbbing in time with the steady tapping that guided me deeper. Shadows flickered on the edge of my vision, sometimes revealing the gaunt faces of dead miners, their eyes empty sockets. They'd beckon, moaning in voices that sounded like shifting gravel. Far in the distance, a colossal shape slithered through the darkness, a mass of writhing limbs or tentacles scraping across the rock. And always, I'd hear it, a low, guttural roar that pressed in from all sides. One night, I woke to find my windows rattling, though there was no wind outside. I rushed to the sill, heart pounding. Moonlight bathed the lonely street. Nothing moved, but the glass vibrated like a tuning fork. Faintly, I heard that rhythmic tapping rising from beneath the ground, carrying through the foundation of my house. It was as if the mountain itself reached out to claim the town, inch by inch. Summit Star tried to maintain a public facade of confidence. They issued statements about minor geological anomalies and unexplained sightings. They insisted they were working with the authorities, taking every safety measure. But their workforce was shrinking rapidly. Every day, more miners quit or disappeared. A few turned up wandering the roads in a daze, covered in black dust that left stains on their flesh. One miner, eyes bulging from his skull, babbled about how the tunnels had no end, how they coiled into the earth like veins, and that something monstrous was feeding on the fear of anyone who entered. The deeper Summit Star dug, the more the entity stirred. At least, that was the consensus among the frightened populace. We had no scientific explanation, no proof, just the creeping dread that each foot drilled further into the mind loosened another chain binding the creature. Sheriff Braxton tried to reason with the company's executives, begging them to shut down operations, but they refused. Profits soared as they extracted rare minerals, valuable enough to ignore the local superstition. And the accidents, those were just the cost of doing business, right? My final descent into the mine happened on a bitterly cold morning. Lucy was going down to collect more samples, determined to gather evidence of the danger. She believed that if she could produce undeniable proof of some unknown hazard, biological or otherwise, the authorities or federal agencies might step in and halt the drilling. I couldn't let her go alone. We slipped past the chain-link fence before dawn, armed with flashlights, rope, and a camera. A handful of exhausted security guards dozed in a trailer near the entrance. We crept along the dark corridors, stepping over collapsed beams and twisted rails. Our flashlights played across graffiti left by long-dead miners, scrawled in sooty smears, "Help and God Save U.S." The deeper we went, the colder it got, though it was not the crisp cold of mountain air. This was the clammy, almost humid cold of a crypt. The smell of sulfur intensified. At some point, we passed a battered sign that read Shaft 9 to Danger, Unstable. The letters were streaked with rust that formed patterns like crying faces. Lucy paused to snap photos. The tapping resumed, faint but unceasing, echoing through side tunnels that branched off in labyrinthine complexity. We tried to map our route, but soon realized the official diagrams were useless. Some of these passages shouldn't exist. It was as though the mine had grown, twisting and reshaping itself over the decades. Then we saw them, shadows flickering at the edges of our flashlight's beams. Lucy gasped, nearly dropping her camera. I forced my hand to remain steady. The shapes moved like people, slow, uneven steps, heads tilted at unnatural angles. Now and then, a face caught the light, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, rotting flesh. They drifted in and out of doorways, merging seamlessly with the darkness. Our nerves frayed with every step. A turning point came when Lucy shone her light on one figure that stood just a few yards away, gazing at us with an expression that was both vacant and agonized. Its features were those of Sam Rodriguez, the missing miner. Except he looked like he'd aged 100 years in a matter of weeks. His lips parted in a silent plea, revealing blackened gums. Lucy whispered his name, her voice cracking. He raised an arm, pointing deeper into the tunnel, then vanished as though swallowed by the shadows. Something told us we were being guided, or perhaps herded. I felt an internal push, a compulsion to follow the path. My heart hammered so loudly I feared it would burst. The tapping grew louder, more rapid, in tandem with each step we took. Lucy pressed on, determined to see what lay at the end. We arrived at a large chamber, the walls carved into pillars of rock that loomed like giant ribs. The stench here was overpowering, a mix of decay and something older, more alien. Fragments of old machinery lay scattered around, twisted rails and shattered lanterns from a bygone era. In the center of the cavern gaped a massive pit, its edges jagged with half-collapsed stone. A foul wind blew up from below, carrying a chorus of whispered moans that resonated in my skull. We inched closer. My flashlight beam revealed an unspeakable sight, half-buried bodies strewn around the pit's rim, some fresh, some centuries old, all contorted in final poses of agony. Among them, battered helmets, pickaxes, scraps of modern gear. It was a graveyard, a feeding ground for something in the depths. Lucy gagged, fighting the urge to vomit. Then the voice came, if you can call it a voice at all, more like a rumble from the stone itself. Deep, resonant, ancient. It spoke inside my head, bypassing my ears. I couldn't grasp the words, if they were even words, but I understood the meaning. It demanded more. More workers, more souls, more life dragged beneath the earth to feed an endless hunger. The entire chamber trembled in response. The shadows around us converged, the ghosts of countless miners, men from every era who had lost their lives here. Their eyes glowed with a dull luminescence. They moaned, reaching out with skeletal hands, but I sensed they were not the threat. They were slaves, trapped in eternal servitude to this monstrous presence. Lucy, tears streaming down her face, tried to snap photos or record video, but an unseen force knocked the camera from her grip. We stumbled back, hearts pounding, as the pit itself seemed to churn, the blackness within stirring with a reptilian hiss. A shape began to rise, a formless mass of twisting limbs or tendrils glistening with slime and dust. A single, massive eye, if you could call that pulsating orb an eye, surfaced from the void, staring at us with ancient malevolence. I felt my mind teetering on the brink of madness. Every nerve screamed for me to run, but I couldn't even move. Lucy found her voice first, shrieking in terror. That raw sound freed me from my paralysis. We turned and fled, ignoring the rotted beams that threatened to collapse on our heads, ignoring the gaunt figures that reached for us. The tapping crescendoed into a furious hammering, pounding in my ears until I thought my skull would burst. We never should have gone in. That entity, whatever it was, had awakened fully, and it hungered. Something older than any ghost, fueled by the centuries of blood spilled in these tunnels. We barely made it out, lungs on fire, dust coating every inch of our faces. By the time we emerged into daylight, the sun felt alien, too bright, as if the earth itself rejected us. We found the sheriff waiting with a small posse. Their faces paled when they saw our condition. Lucy and I babbled about the horrors below, urging them to seal the mine forever. Sheriff Braxton looked conflicted. Some of his deputies wanted to mount a rescue mission for any survivors. Others insisted they torch the entire place. Desperation hung heavy in the air. Summit Star's corporate reps arrived in shiny SUVs, spouting legal threats. They demanded we step aside, insisted the mine was their property. Lucy tried to show them her rock samples and scribbled notes, but they refused to listen. They planned to keep drilling, unstoppable in their greed. That was when Braxton's patience snapped. He threatened to forcibly shut them down, legal consequences be damned. In the end, the sheriff took a drastic step. As the sun set that evening, a group of deputies hauled in barrels of diesel and explosives left over from the construction crews. The plan was to cause a controlled collapse, burying the main tunnels under tons of rubble, in hopes of sealing that monstrosity away. Lucy and I stood with them, hearts pounding, as they wired the charges at the entrance and along the deeper shafts they could safely reach. The night was eerily silent, except for the whisper of wind through the pines. We all huddled behind parked vehicles, adrenaline surging. When Braxton pushed the detonator, the roar was deafening. Chunks of rock blasted skyward, and the mountain trembled like a living thing in rage. Clouds of dust engulfed us. As the rumble subsided, a cacophony of shrieks reverberated from deep within the ground. It was the sound of something gargantuan and enraged, an unearthly bellow that made grown men collapse in terror. Then, an abrupt silence. For a long time, no one spoke. The dust settled, revealing a mountain slope collapsed in on itself, the mine entrance buried under a chaotic jumble of boulders and twisted metal. Some people wept with relief. Others stared grimly at the ruin, uncertain if we truly stopped it. In the following weeks, Summit Star's executives vanished from Blackridge Creek, facing legal battles and local fury. Rumors claimed they'd lost more than half their workforce to unexplainable disappearances and mental breakdowns. The company's stocks plummeted. For the town, a solemn calm returned, though it was tinged with grief for the lives lost. We all pretended things were normal, but we knew the truth. Sometimes at night, I still hear the faintest tapping, as if whatever lurks below is still alive, gnawing its way through the rubble. Some nights, I dream of the pit, of that colossal eye swirling with hungry madness, and I wake drenched in sweat, half expecting it to burst up through my floor. Lucy tries to reassure me, telling me we buried it for good. But I see the doubt in her eyes. Legends never die here in Colorado, they just burrow deeper, waiting for the next wave of human folly to unearth them. Standing on the outskirts of Blackridge Creek at dusk, I can't help but think about how fragile our victory might be. Because even the thickest barricade of stone can be worn down by time and greed. And the ancient presence under the mountain is nothing if not patient. Now, I write these words as both a warning and an admission of guilt. We awoke the thing in the mine. Our ambition, our greed, our ignorance, one day, it might come calling again. And when it does, it won't just take a handful of miners. It will pull us all into the belly of the earth, burying us in a darkness where no sun will ever shine. If you find yourself wandering near a forgotten mining town, listen carefully to the wind. Should you hear that tapping, methodical and relentless, do yourself a favor and run. Because once the mine's curse has been unleashed, there may be no place left to hide. Story number 3. The Harvest Night. There's something special about autumn in a small Midwestern town. The air is crisp, the leaves crackle underfoot, and the scent of cinnamon and burning wood hangs in the breeze. In Graysfield, where I've lived all my life, autumn isn't just a season, it's a celebration. Every October, we host a harvest festival, a week-long event with pumpkin carving contests, hay rides, corn mazes, and bonfires. But the centerpiece of it all, the thing that really draws people from miles around, is the Scarecrow Parade. I used to love it. Who wouldn't? The streets fill with handmade scarecrows of every shape and size, from simple ones with burlap heads to intricate creations wearing patched suits and hats, their straw-stuffed bodies posed in funny or menacing ways. Townsfolk compete to see who can make the best one, and every year the mayor awards a blue ribbon to the most creative scarecrow. By the time the festival ends, the scarecrows are everywhere, perched on porches, standing in fields, leaning against lampposts. They're harmless, really, just bundles of straw and fabric. At least, that's what I thought until this year. It started the week leading up to the festival. I was helping my best friend, Drew, set up his family's pumpkin stand near the town square. His parents grow some of the biggest pumpkins you've ever seen, the kind that take 2 men to lift. I'd been stacking the smaller ones into neat piles when Mrs. Hargrove, one of our older neighbors, wandered over. She was a frail woman with sharp eyes, the kind of person who always seemed to know more than she let on. That day, her gaze lingered on the scarecrow Drew had propped up next to the stand. It was a simple one, just a wooden frame stuffed with hay, wearing a plaid shirt and a floppy hat. "Careful with that one," she said, her voice low and trembling. Drew and I exchanged a glance. "What do you mean?" he asked, brushing hay off his hands. Mrs. Hargrove leaned closer, her eyes darting around like she was afraid someone might overhear. "They used to say the scarecrows could wake up during harvest night," she whispered. "That's why my mother never made one. said it was bad luck. If you leave a piece of yourself in the straw, hair, blood, anything, they'll come looking for you. She gave us a pointed look, then shuffled away without another word. Drew rolled his eyes as soon as she was out of earshot. Crazy old bat, he muttered, turning back to the pumpkins. But her words stuck with me. Growing up, I'd heard whispers of old superstitions tied to the scarecrows, stories about how they were used to ward off evil spirits or how they could supposedly come to life if you weren't careful. I dismissed them as just spooky tales parents told their kids to keep them from playing in the fields. Now, though, I wasn't so sure. By the time the festival began, the whole town was decked out in scarecrows. They lined the streets, sat in windows, and leaned against fences, their stitched faces grinning in the autumn light. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were too many this year. It was as if they'd multiplied overnight, sprouting like weeds in every corner of Gray's Field. That first night, I joined Drew, his girlfriend Chloe, and my younger sister, Emma, for the opening bonfire. We roasted marshmallows and listened to the mayor give his usual speech about how the festival was a celebration of community and tradition. The crowd cheered, and the band struck up a lively tune. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. Then, as the bonfire crackled and the music swelled, I noticed a figure standing just beyond the ring of light. It was a scarecrow, but not one I recognized. Its head was a burlap sack stitched with jagged excess for eyes and a crooked smile. Its arms dangled limply at its sides, and its straw legs bent awkwardly, as though it had been hastily thrown together. I nudged Drew. "Did you see who put that there?" He squinted into the shadows. "What?" "It's probably one of the decorations. Don't overthink it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been there a moment ago. The next few days passed uneventfully, though I couldn't stop noticing the scarecrows. They seemed off. Sometimes I'd swear they were standing in slightly different positions than before. One evening, I found a pile of straw on the porch, as though something had shed its stuffing there. Drew teased me for being paranoid, but Emma wasn't so quick to dismiss my concerns. "Do you think it's true?" "What Mrs. Hargrove said," she asked as we walked through the corn maze one afternoon. I hesitated. "I don't know. Probably not. But it wouldn't hurt to be careful." She nodded solemnly. "Do you think they're watching us?" Before I could answer, Drew called from ahead, laughing as he held up an ear of corn shaped like a heart. "You guys coming, or what?" We followed, but the unease lingered. The turning point came on the night of the Scarecrow Parade. It was the festival's main event, a procession of people carrying their homemade scarecrows through the streets, lit by lanterns and accompanied by the sound of fiddles and drums. Families lined the sidewalks to cheer and clap, their faces glowing with excitement. Chloe and Emma were ahead of me, their laughter mingling with the music. Drew walked beside me, his scarecrow propped on his shoulder. As the procession passed the town square, I noticed something strange, a cluster of scarecrows that hadn't been there earlier. They stood near the fountain, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their stitched faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Drew," I whispered, "those scarecrows, did anyone bring them here?" He followed my gaze and frowned. "No idea. Maybe the town set them up?" But I couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong. The parade wound through the streets and ended at the edge of the cornfields, where the mayor gave another speech about the importance of preserving tradition. As the crowd dispersed, I noticed one of the scarecrows from the fountain standing among the spectators. Its head turned slightly, as if following the mayor's movements. I grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her closer. That night, the scarecrows came to life. It started with the sound of rustling straw. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, faint at first, then louder, like dry grass brushing against wood. I sat up, heart pounding, and peered out the window. In the moonlight, I saw them moving through the streets, scarecrows with jerky, uncoordinated movements, their limbs creaking as they dragged themselves forward. I ran to Emma's room and shook her awake. "We need to go. Now." She blinked groggily, then froze when she heard the rustling outside. Together, we crept downstairs, where Drew and Chloe were already waiting, their faces pale. "They're everywhere," Drew whispered, pointing to the window. We huddled in the living room, whispering plans. The scarecrows seemed to be drawn to movement, so we stayed as still as possible, listening to the rustling grow louder. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of their twisted faces peering through the windows, their stitched smiles frozen in mockery. As dawn approached, the scarecrows retreated, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. We emerged from the house, shaken but unharmed. Around town, the scene was chaotic, broken windows, torn fences, and straw scattered everywhere. Some families were missing, their doors hanging open as if they'd fled in a panic. Over the next few days, we pieced together the truth. Mrs. Hargrove, who had survived the night, told us the legend of the Harvest Curse, a spell cast by a witch long ago to punish the town for an unjust execution. The scarecrows, she explained, were vessels for the souls of the wrongfully dead, brought to life each year to claim vengeance. They'll keep coming until the curse is broken, she warned. And the only way to break it is to destroy the witch's talisman. We didn't have much time. With Mrs. Hargrove's help, we discovered that the talisman, a weathered, blood-stained amulet, was hidden in the town's oldest scarecrow, a towering figure that stood in the cornfield at the festival's edge. Armed with torches and axes, we ventured into the field that night, determined to end the nightmare. The scarecrows attacked in droves, their straw bodies igniting as we fought our way forward. The air filled with the acrid stench of burning hay and the haunting cries of the souls trapped within. Drew and Chloe held them off while Emma and I reached the giant scarecrow. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its laughter echoed through the night as we hacked at its frame. Finally, we found the amulet embedded in its chest. Emma grabbed it and smashed it against a rock, shattering it into pieces. The scarecrows froze mid-attack, their bodies crumbling to dust as the curse lifted. The next morning, Graysfield was quiet. The streets were littered with ash and straw, but the scarecrows were gone. People emerged from their homes, shaken but alive. The Harvest Festival was canceled, and the town agreed to dismantle every scarecrow left behind. For now, the curse is broken. But every October, when the leaves turn and the air grows cold, I can't help but glance toward the cornfields and wonder if the witch's vengeance truly ended, or if it's only sleeping, waiting for the right moment to rise again.